I'm Emily Carter, 28 years old. And I'll never forget the moment I heard my father's voice cutting through the darkness. Turn off the machines, Kenneth. We can't afford this anymore. His words sliced through the fog in my brain like ice water. I was trapped in my own body, unable to move, unable to scream, but I could hear everything. My mother's weak protest dissolved into silence as my father continued his cold calculation of my worth versus their bank account. The ventilator hummed beside me, each breath it pushed into my lungs suddenly feeling precious and numbered. But here's what they didn't know. I was waking up, and I was listening to every single word. What happened next changed everything. My parents thought they were making a difficult financial decision. They had no idea they were about to face the fight of their lives. Because when I finally opened my eyes, I didn't just survive. I made sure they answered for what they tried to do. Stay with me because this story goes places you won't see coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up as Emily Carter meant living in a house where money was the answer to every question. My father, Kenneth, had spent 30 years as an insurance adjuster, a job that taught him to see everything through the lens of cost and benefit. He could walk through our home in Beaverton and assign a dollar value to every piece of furniture, every appliance, every choice we made. Nothing escaped his mental ledger. By the time I was 8 years old, I understood that love in the Carter household came with terms and conditions. Kenneth wasn't cruel in the obvious ways. He never raised his hand, never screamed. His control was quieter, more insidious. He governed through spreadsheets and disappointed sighs. When I wanted to take art classes in middle school, he pulled out a calculator and showed me the cost per hour versus the potential return on investment. Art doesn't pay the bills, Emily, he said, his voice flat and final. He steered me toward practical pursuits, things that made sense on paper. My dreams of becoming a designer were tolerated only when I reframed them as graphic design, something that could generate income. My mother, Barbara, worked part-time as a bookkeeper for a small medical office. She was good with numbers, which made sense given who she married. But where Kenneth wielded finances like a weapon, Barbara simply surrendered to them. She had a way of disappearing into the background of any room, her opinions dissolving before they fully formed. I remember being 12 and asking her if I could go to summer camp with my friends. She glanced at Kenneth, saw the slight shake of his head, and told me we needed to save money that year. She never said no herself. She just channeled his refusals through her softer voice, as if that made them easier to swallow. My older brother Daniel was different. 3 years my senior, he seemed to instinctively understand how to navigate our father's world. He studied accounting at Portland State, joined Kenneth for Sunday morning review sessions of the family budget, and never questioned the path laid out for him. At family dinners, he would nod along as Kenneth lectured about fiscal responsibility and planning for the future. I used to think Daniel believed it all, that he was a true convert to our father's religion of cost analysis. But sometimes I'd catch him staring out the window during those lectures, his jaw tight, and I wondered if he was as trapped as I was. The Carter family operated on a simple principle. Everything had a price and nothing was worth more than what you paid for it. Kenneth kept meticulous records of every expense, every purchase, every decision. He had filing cabinets full of receipts going back decades. He knew exactly how much my childhood had cost him down to the penny. He reminded me of this often, not with anger but with the casual certainty of someone reading from a balance sheet. We've invested a lot in you, Emily. Make sure it pays off. The implication was clear. I was an asset that needed to generate returns. When I turned 18 and announced I wanted to study graphic design at the Art Institute, Kenneth pulled out a folder he'd prepared. Inside were printouts comparing tuition costs, average starting salaries for designers, and projected loan repayment schedules. This doesn't make financial sense, he said, sliding the papers across the kitchen table. You'd be better off at a state school studying business. I looked at my mother, hoping for support, but she was focused intently on her coffee mug. Daniel sat beside Kenneth, silent. I felt the walls closing in. I went to the state school. I studied marketing because it was close enough to design to keep a piece of my dream alive. I lived at home to save money, commuting an hour each way because Kenneth insisted room and board were unnecessary expenses. Every decision about my life ran through his approval process. When I wanted to study abroad junior year, he calculated the costs and denied it. When I tried to join a design club that required membership fees, he questioned the value. I learned to make myself smaller, to want less, to ask for nothing. After graduation, I started freelancing as a graphic designer, taking on small clients and building a portfolio. I moved into a tiny studio apartment in Portland, finally tasting independence. Kenneth disapproved of the rent, of course, but I was 23 and desperate for space that was mine. For the first time, I was making decisions without running them past him. I chose my clients, set my rates, and built something that belonged to me alone. It wasn't much, but it was mine. My relationship with my parents during those years was cordial but distant. I'd drive out to Beaverton for the occasional Sunday dinner, sitting through Kenneth's interrogations about my income and expenses. Are you maxing out your retirement contributions? Have you considered a more stable position? Barbara would serve pot roast and change the subject to the weather. Daniel would show up with his wife, Christine, and we'd all perform the ritual of family dinner without any of the warmth that should accompany it. But beneath the surface of those strained meals, I was building a life. I met Michael Hayes at a coffee shop in downtown Portland, where I was working on a client presentation. He was a physical therapist who'd moved to Oregon from California, drawn by the mountains and the rain. We started talking about design and movement, about how bodies heal and how visual communication works. He saw the world differently than anyone I'd known. Where Kenneth saw costs, Michael saw possibilities. Where my family saw risk, he saw adventure. Michael and I fell into an easy rhythm. He'd stop by my apartment after his shifts at the rehabilitation center, and we'd cook dinner together while I told him about difficult clients and design challenges. He never once asked me to justify my career choice or calculate its return on investment. He just listened and encouraged. When I landed a major client and celebrated, he celebrated with me. When I lost a bid and felt defeated, he reminded me that setbacks were part of growth. For the first time in my life, I felt seen for who I was, not for what I could produce. I didn't introduce Michael to my parents for almost a year. I knew what would happen. I knew Kenneth would interrogate him, assess him, and find him wanting. Physical therapists made decent money, but not enough to impress a man who measured worth in six-figure increments. And Michael's approach to life, his emphasis on meaning over money, would strike Kenneth as naive at best and reckless at worst. I wanted to protect what we had from my father's cold scrutiny. But eventually Michael asked to meet them. He didn't understand why I kept that part of my life separate. So I drove him out to Beaverton on a Sunday afternoon. My stomach knotted with dread. The dinner went exactly as I predicted. Kenneth barely looked at Michael when they shook hands. Over Barbara's carefully prepared meal, Kenneth asked Michael about his career trajectory, his financial planning, his long-term goals. Michael answered honestly, talking about his passion for helping people recover from injuries, his hope to eventually open his own practice. Kenneth's expression never changed, but I could see the judgment settling in. Your work sounds rewarding, Kenneth said, in a tone that made rewarding sound like a euphemism for unprofitable. But have you considered the income ceiling in that field? Michael smiled politely and said he'd rather love his work than chase bigger paychecks. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Barbara busied herself clearing plates that were still full. Daniel coughed and changed the subject to something about tax season. I sat there wishing I could disappear. After dinner, as Michael and I drove back to Portland, he was quiet. Finally, he said, "Your father doesn't approve of me." I wanted to lie to soften it, but I couldn't. No, I said. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He doesn't. Michael reached over and took my hand. That's his problem, not ours. But I knew it wasn't that simple. Kenneth had a way of making his problems everyone else's burden. Over the following months, my father made his disapproval clear. He'd call me and ask pointed questions about my relationship. Is this serious? Are you thinking long-term? What's his financial situation? When I pushed back, he'd shift tactics. I'm just concerned about your future, Emily. You've worked hard to build stability. Don't throw it away on someone who can't match your ambition. The implication stung. Michael wasn't enough. And by extension, my choice to love him proved I wasn't thinking clearly. Barbara would occasionally text me, gentle messages that said she just wanted me to be happy. But when I'd ask her to tell Kenneth to back off, she'd go silent. Daniel avoided the topic entirely. I was on my own, defending a relationship that needed no defense, except in the eyes of a man who'd never understood that some things couldn't be quantified. Then came March 15th. I was driving home from a client meeting in Vancouver, Washington, just across the Columbia River. It was raining, the kind of heavy Pacific Northwest downpour that turns highways into rivers. I was careful, staying in the right lane, keeping my speed reasonable. I never saw the other car. A drunk driver, I later learned, crossed the median doing 70 and hit me head-on. The impact was instant and absolute. Everything went dark. I don't remember the ambulance or the emergency room. I don't remember the first surgery or the doctors explaining to my family that I had a severe traumatic brain injury. I don't remember them placing me in a medically induced coma to let my brain swell without causing more damage. For me, there was just darkness and then slowly the emergence of sound. Beeping machines, distant voices, the hiss of a ventilator. I couldn't open my eyes. I couldn't move my fingers, but I could hear. The first voice I recognized was Kenneth's. He was talking to someone, his tone clipped and businesslike. The insurance will cover most of it, but we're looking at significant out-of-pocket costs. There's a cap on the policy. I tried to understand what he was saying, tried to place myself in the conversation. Then I heard my mother. How long do they think she'll need to be on the machines? Kenneth's response was cold. They don't know. Could be weeks. Could be months. We need to be realistic about this. Realistic. The word echoed in my head. I wanted to scream, to tell them I was there, that I could hear them. But my body wouldn't respond. I was a prisoner in my own skull, aware but helpless. Over the next days or maybe weeks, time was impossible to track. I listened to fragments of conversations. Doctors explaining my prognosis. Kenneth asking about costs. Barbara crying softly. Daniel talking about taking time off work. And Michael. I heard Michael's voice, thick with emotion, telling me to fight, to come back. I tried. I focused every ounce of energy on moving a finger, opening an eye, anything to signal that I was still in there. But nothing worked. The darkness held me fast. And then, one afternoon, I heard the conversation that changed everything. Kenneth and Barbara were in my room. The machines beeped steadily around me. My father's voice was low but clear. We need to talk about the reality of this situation. She's been under for 6 weeks. The bills are piling up. Even with insurance, we're going to be on the hook for over $200,000. Barbara's voice was shaky, but the doctors said she might still wake up. They said it's too early to give up. Kenneth sighed, the sound heavy with impatience. They say that because they have to. But look at the numbers, Barbara. Every day she's on these machines costs us thousands. We've already burned through most of our savings. We need to think about our future. Our retirement. We can't let this destroy us financially. I felt something shift inside me. A cold realization crystallizing through the fog. He was talking about ending my life support. My own father was calculating whether I was worth the expense. Barbara was crying now, her sobs muffled. I can't, Kenneth. She's our daughter. How can you even suggest this? His response was measured, almost gentle. I'm not suggesting we do anything cruel. But we have to be practical. If she's not going to recover, keeping her on these machines isn't helping anyone. It's just prolonging the inevitable and bankrupting us in the process. The rage that surged through me was unlike anything I'd ever felt. It was pure and clarifying. I focused every particle of my being on my right hand. Move. Please move. I begged my body to obey, to give me any sign that I could send. My finger twitched. I felt it. A tiny movement, barely there but real. I did it again. Kenneth was still talking, laying out his case like he was adjusting an insurance claim. We'll talk to the doctors tomorrow about transitioning to comfort care. It's the humane thing to do. My finger moved again, stronger this time. Then another finger. I was waking up. The realization flooded me with desperate urgency. I had to show them I was here before Kenneth convinced Barbara to pull the plug. I focused on my eyes, trying to force them open. The lids felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. Come on, Emily. Fight. The darkness started to recede just slightly. A sliver of light penetrated. I could see blurry shapes. The hospital room. My parents standing by the window, their backs to me. Kenneth's voice continued. I've already spoken with Daniel. He agrees this is the right choice. We'll make it quick and painless. She won't suffer. The patronizing certainty in his tone made my blood boil. I wasn't dead. I wasn't gone. And I sure as hell wasn't going to let him make this decision. I forced my eyes wider, blinking against the harsh fluorescent light. My throat felt raw from the breathing tube. I tried to make a sound, any sound. A groan escaped, small and weak, but there. Barbara turned first. Her eyes went wide. "Kenneth," she gasped. "Kenneth, look." He turned slowly, skepticism written across his face. Then he saw me. My eyes were open, staring directly at him. For a moment we just looked at each other. I saw the flash of something in his expression. Not relief. Not joy. Shock, yes, but also something darker. Calculation. He was already adjusting his plans, recalibrating. Barbara rushed to my bedside, her hands fluttering nervously. "Emily. Oh my God, Emily. Can you hear me?" I managed the smallest nod. My body still felt disconnected, unresponsive, but I was there. The nurse call button was pressed. Within seconds, the room flooded with medical staff. Doctors shone lights in my eyes, asked me to squeeze their hands, tested my responses. I did everything I could to show them I was present, aware, fighting. Kenneth stood back, his face unreadable. Barbara held my hand, crying and laughing at the same time. Over the next hours, they removed the breathing tube, a process that felt like drowning in reverse. I coughed and gasped, my throat burning. But I could breathe on my own. I could speak, though my voice came out as barely a whisper. The doctor, a kind woman with gray hair and steady hands, explained what had happened. "You were in a serious accident. You've been in a medically induced coma for 6 weeks. The fact that you're waking up now is remarkable." She called it a miracle. I called it survival instinct fueled by fury. When the initial chaos settled and the doctors left to run more tests, Barbara sat beside my bed, stroking my hair. "We were so worried," she said softly. "We didn't know if you'd come back to us." I looked at her, then at Kenneth, who stood by the door. "I heard you," I whispered, my voice raspy and weak. "I heard everything." Barbara frowned, confused. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "I heard Dad," I said, each word an effort. "I heard him say to turn off the machines. To let me die because of the money." The color drained from Barbara's face. Kenneth's expression hardened. "You were unconscious, Emily. You're confused. Your brain is still recovering. You don't know what you heard." But I did know. And in that moment, staring at my father's cold eyes, I made a decision. I wasn't just going to survive this. I was going to make sure he never had the power to do this to anyone again. I was going to fight back with everything I had. And this time I wasn't alone. This time I had witnesses. The first week after waking was a blur of medical tests and physical assessments. My body had atrophied during the coma, muscles weak from disuse. Simple tasks like holding a cup or sitting upright without support felt monumental. The neurologist, Dr. Patricia Valdez, ran cognitive tests that exhausted me. She'd show me cards with pictures and ask me to name them, have me count backward from 100, test my memory of events before the accident. I passed everything, my mind sharp even if my body was struggling to catch up. Kenneth visited daily, always during approved visiting hours, always with Barbara in tow. He'd stand at the foot of my bed with his hands clasped, asking the doctors questions about my prognosis and recovery timeline. He never asked me how I felt. He never apologized for what I'd overheard. Instead, he'd tell me about the insurance claims he was filing, the paperwork he was managing, positioning himself as the devoted father handling the burden of my care. Barbara would sit beside me, holding my hand, her touch gentle but her silence deafening. I didn't confront them immediately. I was too weak, too vulnerable lying in that hospital bed with monitors tracking every heartbeat. But I also knew I needed to be strategic. Kenneth had spent my entire life teaching me that preparation mattered, that documentation was everything. I was going to use his own lessons against him. Every time he visited, I made mental notes of what he said, how he positioned things. I waited and watched. Rachel Thompson changed everything. She was one of the ICU nurses who'd cared for me during my coma, a woman about my age with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that missed nothing. On my 8th day awake, she came in to check my vitals during a quiet afternoon shift. As she adjusted my she said softly, "I'm glad you made it back." There were some conversations happening around here that didn't sit right with me. I looked at her carefully. What kind of conversations? Rachel glanced at the door, then back at me. Your father was asking questions about what happens when families decide to withdraw life support. He wanted to know the process, the timeline, the costs associated with keeping someone on a ventilator long term. This was about 3 weeks into your coma. I documented it in my notes because it seemed premature. You were stable. Your brain activity was good. There was no medical reason to be having those discussions yet. My heart rate monitor beeped faster. Rachel noticed. Hey, stay calm. I'm telling you this because I think you should know. And because I heard him on the phone one day outside your room. He was talking to someone about the financial burden and how difficult it was to make these decisions. But his tone, it wasn't grief. It was irritation. Like you were a problem to be solved. I've been doing this job for 7 years. I know what real anguish looks like, and that wasn't it. Can you prove it? I asked, my voice still weak but determined. Rachel nodded slowly. I have my nursing notes. They're part of your medical record. And there might be security footage from the hallways, though I don't know how long they keep that. If you're thinking about doing something official with this information, you'd need a lawyer. Hospital documentation is tricky without proper legal channels. But I'll help however I can. What he was planning, it wasn't right. I felt something shift in my chest. Validation. I wasn't imagining things or misunderstanding through the fog of a recovering brain. A trained professional had witnessed my father's calculations and found them disturbing enough to document. Rachel, why are you telling me this? I asked. She finished checking the monitor and met my eyes directly. Because I became a nurse to protect people who can't protect themselves. You couldn't speak for yourself then. But you can now. And somebody needs to stand up to men like your father who think they can make these kinds of decisions based on their bank balance. That conversation planted the seed. Over the next few days, as my strength slowly returned, I started thinking strategically. I needed evidence. I needed allies. And I needed to understand exactly what Kenneth had been planning before I woke up. Rachel brought me copies of her nursing notes, printed out after her shift and delivered in an unmarked envelope. The documentation was clinical but clear. Patient's father inquiring about life support withdrawal protocols. Patient remained stable with positive neurological indicators. Premature discussion noted and logged. Michael visited every day, usually in the evenings after his last physical therapy appointments. He'd bring me books and music, sit beside my bed and tell me about his day. His voice a lifeline to the world outside these sterile walls. When I finally told him what I'd overheard while in the coma, his face went pale. Emily, that's horrifying. Your own father was going to pull the plug for money? I nodded, too angry for tears. And he almost convinced my mom to go along with it. If I hadn't woken up when I did, I'd be dead. Michael took my hand carefully, mindful of the 4-line. What are you going to do? I looked at him, this man who'd stood by me through everything, who'd spent weeks talking to my unresponsive body because he refused to give up hope. I'm going to make sure he can never do this again. Not to me, not to anyone. I need help though. I need to understand my legal options. Michael pulled out his phone. I know someone. Jennifer Martinez. She handled a case for one of my patients last year, a medical malpractice situation. She's tough and she doesn't back down. Want me to reach out? Within 2 days, Jennifer Martinez came to my hospital room. She was a woman in her mid-40s with sharp features and an even sharper mind, carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it had seen 100 courtroom battles. She sat down, pulled out a legal pad and said, "Tell me everything." I did. I told her about growing up under Kenneth's financial tyranny, about the control and the conditions attached to every aspect of my life. I told her about waking up and hearing him discuss ending my life support to save money. I told her about Rachel's documentation and my father's history of treating people like balance sheets. Jennifer listened without interrupting, taking notes in precise handwriting. When I finished, she sat back and tapped her pen against the pad. This is complex. What your father discussed doing isn't technically illegal in Oregon. Families have the right to make end-of-life decisions for incapacitated relatives. However, the motivation matters. If he was acting primarily out of financial self-interest rather than your medical best interest, that crosses into ethically and potentially legally problematic territory. She paused. The fact that you were showing positive signs of recovery and he was still pushing for withdrawal, that's significant. What are my options? I asked. Jennifer leaned forward. Several paths. First, we can pursue a civil case for emotional distress and potentially financial elder abuse, though you're young for that statute. Second, we can file complaints with the medical board about premature life support discussions. Third, and this is the big one, we can investigate whether he has any financial power of attorney or access to your assets that he's been misusing. If he was planning to benefit financially from your death, that's fraud at minimum, potentially attempted murder depending on how we frame it. Murder? The word hit me like a physical blow. Jennifer's expression didn't change. I'm not saying we'd win that charge. But think about it. He knew you had a chance of recovery. Medical professionals were telling him to wait. And he was pushing to end your life specifically because of the cost to him. That's not a mercy killing. That's killing for financial gain. At minimum, it's conspiracy to commit wrongful death. We'd need more evidence, but it's not off the table. My head spun. I'd been thinking about holding Kenneth accountable, about exposing what he'd tried to do. But criminal charges? That was a different level entirely. What would I need to prove that? Jennifer flipped through her notes. We need documentation of his financial motive. Bank records showing his assets, evidence that the medical bills were impacting him. We need testimony from medical staff about his behavior and requests. We need any recordings or witnesses to his statements about ending your care. And ideally, we need someone from inside your family willing to testify about his character and history of financially motivated decisions. Daniel. The thought came immediately. My brother had been Kenneth's faithful student for years, but I'd seen the cracks in his compliance. And he was an accountant. He'd have access to the family finances. But would he betray our father to help me? Jennifer saw my expression. You're thinking of someone. I nodded. My older brother. He works in finance. He knows everything about my parents' money situation. But I don't know if he'd help. We've never been particularly close. Jennifer smiled grimly. People surprise you when you give them the chance to do the right thing. Want me to approach him? No, I said. I need to talk to him myself. This has to come from me. Jennifer agreed but cautioned me to be careful. Don't reveal your full strategy. Don't give him ammunition to take back to your father. Just feel him out. See if there's an opening. She left me her card and a folder of preliminary documents to review. As she packed up her briefcase, she said something that stuck with me. Your father taught you that everything has a price. Now you're going to teach him that some prices are too high to pay. Daniel came to visit 2 days later alone. Barbara had mentioned he was coming, and I prepared myself mentally for the conversation. He walked in looking uncomfortable. His usual confidence diminished in the hospital setting. Hey, he said, pulling a chair close to the bed. You're looking better. Stronger. I studied my brother, searching for signs of the person I'd glimpsed beneath his compliant exterior. Thanks for coming. I know you've been busy. He waved it off. Family comes first. How are you feeling? Really? Honestly? I feel betrayed. The words came out sharper than I'd intended, but I didn't soften them. Daniel blinked, surprised. Betrayed by who? By Dad, I said, watching his reaction carefully. I heard him. Daniel. While I was in the coma, I heard him tell Mom that they should turn off my life support because of the money, because keeping me alive was too expensive. My brother's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Shock, denial, and then something that looked like resignation. He sat back in the chair, running his hands through his hair. You heard that? It wasn't a question. Yeah, I heard it. And I heard him say that you agreed with him, that you thought it was the right choice. Daniel looked physically ill. He stood up, paced to the window and stared out at the Portland skyline. I didn't agree with him. Not really. He called me after one of his meetings with your doctor, said they were discussing options. He framed it like it was the compassionate thing to do, letting you go peacefully instead of prolonging your suffering. I wasn't suffering, I said quietly. I was healing. The doctors said I had a good chance of recovery. Daniel turned back to me, and I saw something I'd never seen before in my brother's eyes. Guilt. I know. I found out later that he'd cherry-picked information, made it sound worse than it was. But in the moment when he called me, I was at work and distracted, and I just said whatever he wanted to hear. I didn't push back. I didn't question him. And I should have. I'm sorry, Emily. I'm really sorry. The apology surprised me. Kenneth had never apologized for anything in his life, and I'd assumed Daniel was cut from the same cloth. But sitting there, seeing my brother's genuine distress, I realized he wasn't our father. He'd been shaped by Kenneth's worldview, but he hadn't fully calcified into it. There might be a way through. Daniel, I need to know something. And I need you to be completely honest with me. What's Dad's financial situation? Really? Daniel hesitated, the accountant in him warring with whatever loyalty he still felt to our father. Emily, I don't think I should discuss their private finances. These aren't private finances when they're being used to justify ending my life, I shot back. I'm not asking out of curiosity. I'm asking because I need to understand what was really motivating him. Was he actually facing financial ruin because of my medical bills? Or was this about something else? My brother sighed deeply and returned to the chair. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice low. Dad's fine financially. Better than fine, actually. He sold 2 of his investment properties last year for significant profit. He and Mom have about $800,000 in retirement accounts, own their house outright and have minimal debt. Your medical bills were substantial, yes, but his insurance covered most of it. His out-of-pocket maximum was hit within the first week. Everything after that was covered. So the $200,000 he told Mom they'd be on the hook for, I started, was an exaggeration at best, an outright lie at worst, Daniel finished. I've seen the insurance statements. His total out-of-pocket costs for your entire hospitalization would have been around $30,000. Not nothing, but not bankruptcy either. Not for someone with his assets. I felt vindicated and enraged at the same time. So he was willing to let me die to save $30,000? Daniel looked me in the eye. I think it was more than that. I think he saw you as a continued financial liability. Your recovery would mean months of rehabilitation, potential ongoing care. Maybe you not being able to work for a while. He was calculating future costs, not just present ones. It's how he thinks about everything. Every person is a column in his ledger, and if the costs outweigh the benefits, well. He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. I need you to help me, I said. Daniel looked wary. Help you how? I need financial records. Bank statements, insurance documents, anything that shows he wasn't actually in financial distress when he was pushing to end my life support. I need proof that this was about his convenience and his money, not about my medical best interests. Will you help me get that? My brother stood up again, conflict written all over his face. Emily, what you're asking me to do, that's a huge betrayal of Dad's trust. If he finds out I gave you his private financial information, it could destroy whatever relationship we have left. I let the silence hang for a moment, then spoke carefully. Daniel, he was willing to let me die for $30,000. What kind of relationship is worth protecting after that? And more importantly, what happens the next time someone in this family becomes inconvenient or expensive? What happens if it's you in this bed someday, and the math doesn't work in your favor? The question landed. I could see it working through Daniel's mind, the accountant in him running the numbers on his own vulnerability. He sat back down slowly. What exactly do you need? I outlined it carefully. 3 months of bank statements leading up to my accident and during my coma. Insurance correspondence about my medical coverage. Any emails or documents where Kenneth discussed the financial impact of my hospitalization. Daniel pulled out his phone and made a note. I can get most of that. Dad keeps everything digitally backed up, and he gave me access years ago for tax purposes. He's never changed the passwords. Thank you, I said, and meant it. Daniel shook his head. Don't thank me yet. This is going to get ugly, Emily. When Dad finds out you're coming after him, and he will find out, he's not going to just accept it. He's going to fight back with everything he has. I know, I said, but I'm done being afraid of him. I'm done letting him control my life. And I'm done pretending that what he did was okay just because he's family. My brother nodded slowly. Then I'm with you. Not because I'm brave, but because you're right. Someone needs to stand up to him. Over the next 2 weeks, as I continued physical therapy and regained strength, Daniel delivered. He'd stop by during evening visiting hours with his laptop, showing me screenshots and forwarded emails. The financial picture was exactly as he'd described. Kenneth was comfortable, not desperate. The insurance documents showed clear coverage. And buried in his email, Daniel found the smoking gun. A message Kenneth had sent to Barbara 3 weeks into my coma with the subject line "decision time." The email was clinical and cold. "Barbara, we need to seriously consider our options regarding Emily's care. The doctors are being non-committal about her prognosis, which means this could drag on indefinitely. I've run the numbers, and even with insurance we're looking at significant ongoing costs. Our retirement fund is meant to last us 30 years. If we drain it now on what might be a futile effort, we jeopardize our future. I know this is difficult, but we have to think practically. Emily would understand. She's always been sensible about financial matters. I think it's time to talk to the doctors about comfort care measures." Reading those words, seeing my father reduce my life to a line item threatening his retirement plans, crystallized everything. This wasn't a grieving parent making an impossible choice. This was a man protecting his assets. I forwarded the email to Jennifer Martinez with shaking hands. She called me within an hour. "This is exactly what we needed. This shows premeditation and financial motive. Combined with the nursing documentation and the insurance records showing he wasn't actually in financial distress, we have a solid case." "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we decide how hard you want to hit him," Jennifer said. "We can go civil and sue for emotional distress, elder abuse, and breach of fiduciary duty if he had any power of attorney. That would be public, but it wouldn't necessarily result in criminal charges. Or we can take this to the district attorney and push for criminal investigation. Attempted wrongful death, fraud, potentially more depending on what else we uncover. That path is riskier and longer, but the consequences for him would be severe." "I want both," I said. "I want him to face every possible consequence for what he tried to do." Jennifer was quiet for a moment. "Emily, I have to ask. Are you prepared for what this will do to your family? Your mother will be caught in the middle. Your brother will be seen as a traitor by your father. This will destroy relationships that can never be repaired. Are you ready for that?" I thought about Barbara's silence, her inability to stand up to Kenneth even when my life hung in the balance. I thought about all the years of conditional love and financial manipulation. I thought about lying in that hospital bed, hearing my father calmly discuss ending my life like he was canceling a subscription service. "Yes," I said firmly. "I'm ready." "Then let's go to war," Jennifer replied. We filed the civil suit first. The documents were served to Kenneth at his home on a Tuesday morning. Barbara called me within an hour, her voice shaking. "Emily, what is this? Why are you suing your father? We were just trying to do what was best for you." I kept my voice steady. "Mom, he tried to kill me to save money. He wasn't acting in my best interest. He was acting in his financial interest. There's a difference." She tried to argue, to explain, to make excuses. Kenneth had convinced her that they were making a compassionate choice, that they were sparing me prolonged suffering. But I'd heard the actual conversations. I knew the truth. "Mom, you can believe his version or you can believe mine. But I have documentation. I have witnesses. I have his own emails. This is happening whether you support it or not." She hung up crying. Kenneth's response was predictably aggressive. He hired a defense attorney within 48 hours, a man named Douglas Reinhardt who specialized in defending wealthy clients against family lawsuits. Reinhardt immediately filed motions to dismiss, claiming I was mentally incompetent due to my brain injury and being manipulated by opportunistic lawyers. Jennifer countered with medical evaluations showing my cognitive function was completely intact. The legal volleys began. But we weren't just fighting in civil court. Jennifer had taken the evidence to the Multnomah County District Attorney's office. She met with a prosecutor named James Chun who specialized in elder abuse and vulnerable person crimes. While I wasn't elderly, the laws protecting vulnerable adults from financial exploitation applied. Chun reviewed everything: the nursing notes, the emails, the insurance documents, Daniel's testimony, and Rachel's willingness to testify. After 2 weeks, Chun called a meeting. Jennifer and I went to his office downtown, a cramped space filled with case files and legal briefs. Chun was younger than I expected, maybe late 30s, with the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too many family betrayals. He got straight to the point. "This case is unusual, but I think we can make it work. Oregon law prohibits financial exploitation of vulnerable adults. Your father knew you were incapacitated and unable to make decisions. He had temporary medical decision-making authority, and he used that authority in a way that prioritized his financial interests over your medical welfare. What are the charges? Jennifer asked. Chun ticked them off. Criminal mistreatment in the first degree, financial exploitation of a vulnerable person, potentially attempted manslaughter, though that's harder to prove. If convicted, he's looking at several years in prison and significant fines. But I need you to understand, Miss Carter, this will be a long fight. Your father will claim he was acting out of love, making a heartbreaking choice. The defense will paint you as ungrateful and vindictive. Are you prepared for that? I've been preparing for this my whole life, I said. Just in a different way. Kenneth taught me to document everything, to build airtight cases, to never make a move without evidence. I'm using everything he taught me against him. Chun smiled grimly. Then let's proceed. The criminal charges were filed in late May, 3 months after my accident. The news hit Portland's local media quickly. Retired insurance adjuster charged with attempting to end daughter's life support for financial gain. The story was sensational, the kind that sparked heated debates in comment sections and over dinner tables. Was he a monster or a desperate father making an impossible choice? Kenneth maintained his innocence publicly. Through his attorney, he issued statements claiming he'd been acting on medical advice, trying to spare me unnecessary suffering. He positioned himself as the victim of a vindictive daughter who didn't understand the burden he'd carried. Some people believed him, but most people, reading the details of the case, saw through the performance. Barbara stood by him, publicly at least. She appeared beside him at court hearings, her hand in his, her face carefully neutral. But privately she was fracturing. She'd call me late at night, crying, asking why I was doing this to the family. Each time, I'd remind her that I wasn't doing anything to the family. Kenneth had done this. I was just making sure he faced consequences. Daniel took the hardest hit. His decision to provide evidence against our father made him a pariah in Kenneth's eyes. Our father cut off all contact with him, told extended family that Daniel had betrayed his own blood for money, though ironically it was Kenneth who'd been motivated by money all along. Daniel's wife Christine struggled with the fallout, worried about their social standing and what this would mean for their future. But to his credit, Daniel didn't back down. He gave his deposition. He testified when required. He stood up. The physical therapy was grueling, but I attacked it with the same determination I brought to the legal case. Michael worked with me 3 times a week, pushing me to rebuild strength and coordination. Every small victory, walking without assistance, regaining fine motor control in my hands, climbing a flight of stairs, felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that Kenneth had tried to take away. By June, I was strong enough to leave the hospital and move into a rehabilitation facility for outpatient care. Rachel visited me there regularly, becoming something more than a nurse who'd witnessed my father's coldness. She became a friend, someone who understood the complexity of standing up to family. She'd gone through her own battles with a manipulative parent years earlier, and her experience guided me through the darkest moments of doubt. On days when the legal process felt overwhelming, when I questioned whether this fight was worth the cost, Rachel would remind me that silence protected abusers. Speaking up protected future victims. The civil trial was set for September. The criminal trial would follow in November, pending the outcome of preliminary hearings. Jennifer prepared me intensively for testimony, running through every possible question the defense might ask. She warned me that Reinhardt would try to portray me as a spoiled daughter who'd always resented her father's financial prudence, someone twisting a difficult medical decision into a revenge plot. We practiced responses until I could deliver them calmly and clearly, without emotion clouding the facts. But beneath the legal strategy and preparation, I was processing a deeper loss. The family I'd grown up in, dysfunctional as it was, had completely dissolved. There would be no reconciliation, no future holidays together, no pretense of normalcy. Kenneth had made sure of that by refusing to acknowledge any wrongdoing, by doubling down on his justifications. And Barbara, trapped between her daughter and her husband, had chosen Kenneth's version of reality over mine. That hurt more than I wanted to admit. Michael helped me grieve what I'd lost while celebrating what I'd gained. My freedom, my voice, my refusal to accept being treated as disposable. We'd sit on his apartment balcony in the evenings, watching the sun set over Portland, and he'd remind me that families weren't just blood. They were the people who showed up, who fought for you, who refused to give up. By that measure, I had Rachel, Daniel, Jennifer, and Michael himself. That was family enough. As summer turned to fall and the trial dates approached, I felt a strange sense of peace. I'd done everything I could to prepare. The evidence was overwhelming. Multiple witnesses were ready to testify. Kenneth's own words, documented in emails and nursing notes, would condemn him. Whatever the outcome, I'd fought back. I'd refused to be silenced. And that mattered more than any verdict ever could. The woman who'd woken up in that hospital bed, hearing her father plot to end her life, had been terrified and powerless. The woman preparing for trial was neither. Kenneth had taught me to fight with documentation and strategy. Now he was about to learn that lesson from the receiving end. The civil trial began on a gray September morning that felt appropriate for what was about to unfold. The Multnomah County Courthouse stood imposing against the overcast sky, its columns and stone facade radiating the weight of justice. I walked in with Jennifer beside me, Michael holding my hand, and Rachel a few steps behind offering silent support. Daniel was already inside, having arrived early to avoid running into Kenneth and Barbara in the hallways. The courtroom filled quickly with spectators, journalists, and the curious public drawn by the sensational nature of the case. I sat at the plaintiff's table, forcing myself to breathe steadily as people filed in. Then Kenneth entered with Douglas Reinhardt, his expensive suit perfectly tailored, his expression one of dignified suffering. He looked like a man wronged, not a man who'd calculated the cost of his daughter's life. Barbara followed, clutching her purse like a shield, her eyes deliberately avoiding mine. Judge Margaret Holland presided, a woman in her 60s known for her no-nonsense approach and sharp legal mind. She called the court to order and Jennifer rose to deliver her opening statement. She laid out the case methodically, painting a picture of a father who'd viewed his daughter's medical crisis through a purely financial lens. She introduced the evidence we'd be presenting, the nursing notes documenting Kenneth's premature inquiries about life support withdrawal, the emails showing his calculations and concerns about retirement funds, the insurance documents proving he wasn't facing the financial catastrophe he'd claimed. Jennifer's voice was steady and clear as she addressed the jury. This case is about a fundamental betrayal of trust. When Emily Carter lay unconscious and vulnerable, unable to speak or advocate for herself, her father Kenneth Carter held her life in his hands. Medical professionals told him she had a strong chance of recovery. Her brain activity was good. Her vital signs were stable. But instead of hope, Kenneth Carter saw expense. Instead of fighting for his daughter's survival, he fought to protect his bank account. The evidence will show that he prioritized his financial comfort over his daughter's life. And that betrayal is what brings us here today. Reinhardt's opening statement took a different approach. He portrayed Kenneth as a devoted father facing an impossible situation, a man tortured by the prospect of his daughter's suffering. He claimed the emails and conversations were taken out of context, that Kenneth was simply trying to make informed decisions based on limited medical information. He suggested I was bitter about my childhood, resentful of my father's practical approach to finances, and now seeking revenge by twisting his actions during a crisis. The insurance adjuster had spent his career helping families navigate tragedy. Now his own daughter was weaponizing his words against him. The first witness was Dr. Valdez, the neurologist who'd overseen my care. Jennifer walked her through my medical condition during the coma, establishing that while serious, my prognosis was never hopeless. Dr. Valdez testified that my brain scans showed consistent activity, that my responses to stimuli were positive, and that nothing in my medical condition warranted discussions about withdrawing life support during the time frame Kenneth had initiated them. On cross-examination, Reinhardt tried to suggest uncertainty in my prognosis, but Dr. Valdez held firm. The medical standard is to give patients time to heal, unless there's clear evidence of no brain activity or irreversible damage. Emily Carter showed neither. Rachel took the stand next, and I watched her transform from my gentle friend into a professional witness. She recounted Kenneth's conversations with clinical precision, describing how he'd approached her and other nurses asking detailed questions about the process of withdrawing life support. She read from her nursing notes, her voice steady as she detailed Kenneth's focus on costs rather than my medical status. Reinhardt attacked her credibility, suggesting she'd misinterpreted concerned questions from a worried father. But Rachel didn't budge. She'd worked in intensive care for 7 years and knew the difference between a parent seeking medical understanding and someone calculating financial outcomes. When Daniel took the stand, the courtroom tensed. Kenneth's face hardened as his son was sworn in, and Barbara looked like she might be sick. Jennifer guided Daniel through his testimony gently but thoroughly. He explained Kenneth's financial situation, walking the jury through bank statements and retirement accounts that painted a picture of comfortable wealth, not financial desperation. He described the phone call where Kenneth had framed the decision to end my life support as compassionate, then later discovering through insurance documents that the financial burden was minimal compared to their assets. Reinhardt's cross-examination was brutal. He accused Daniel of betraying his father for money, suggesting I'd promised him a share of any settlement. Daniel's jaw tightened but his voice remained calm. I'm not getting anything from this case except the knowledge that I finally did the right thing. My father raised me to value money above everything else, and I'm ashamed it took my sister almost dying for me to see how wrong that was. The answer seemed to resonate with several jurors. I saw them nodding slightly, saw their expressions soften toward my brother. The email was entered into evidence on the third day of trial. Jennifer had it projected on a screen for the entire courtroom to see. Kenneth's words filled the wall, cold and calculated. We have to think practically. Emily would understand. She's always been sensible about financial matters. I think it's time to talk to the doctors about comfort care measures. The jury read it in silence, and I watched their faces register what those words meant. This wasn't a father in agony. This was a financial analysis. Kenneth took the stand in his own defense, and I had to admit he was convincing if you didn't know him. He spoke about the terror of seeing his daughter in the ICU, hooked up to machines, unresponsive. He talked about the doctor's careful language, their refusal to make promises about my recovery. He claimed the email was misunderstood, that he'd been exploring all options as any responsible parent would. He painted himself as someone trying to spare me from a prolonged vegetative state, not someone protecting his retirement account. But Jennifer's cross-examination dismantled his performance piece by piece. She walked him through the insurance documents, making him admit under oath that his out-of-pocket maximum had been reached early in my hospitalization. She confronted him with Rachel's testimony about his specific questions regarding costs. She asked him directly why, if this was about my welfare and not his money. Every documented conversation focused on financial impact rather than medical prognosis. Kenneth tried to maintain his composure, insisting he'd been considering all factors. But his answers grew defensive, his tone sharp. The mask slipped enough for the jury to see what lay beneath. When my turn came to testify, I was surprisingly calm. Jennifer led me through my childhood, establishing the pattern of Kenneth's financial control over every aspect of my life. I described the suppression of my dreams, the conditional nature of his support, the way everything came with a price tag and strings attached. Then I recounted the accident, the coma, and the moment of hearing his voice discussing ending my life support. I spoke clearly about the fear of being trapped in my body, aware but helpless, hearing my father calculate whether I was worth keeping alive. Reinhardt tried to shake me during cross-examination, suggesting my brain injury had affected my memory, that I was confusing dreams with reality. But Dr. Valdez's testimony had already established my cognitive function was intact. He implied I was an ungrateful daughter who'd always resented my father's discipline. I met his eyes steadily and said there's a difference between discipline and control. There's a difference between financial responsibility and reducing your child to a cost-benefit analysis. My father taught me to document everything, to build cases, to prepare. I'm grateful for those lessons because they're how I'm holding him accountable now. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Expert witnesses testified about medical ethics and the standards for life support decisions. Character witnesses spoke to both Kenneth's reputation in the community and to my relationship with my family. The defense brought forward people who praised Kenneth's work helping families navigate insurance claims after tragedies, trying to establish him as someone who cared about others. But the prosecution's case was simply stronger. The documentation was overwhelming, the timeline was clear, and Kenneth's own words condemned him. In her closing argument, Jennifer stood before the jury and spoke with quiet intensity. Kenneth Carter wants you to believe this case is about a difficult medical decision made under impossible circumstances. But the evidence shows something very different. It shows a man who had accurate information about his daughter's prognosis, who knew she had a real chance of recovery, who was not facing financial ruin, and who still chose to prioritize his retirement account over her life. That's not love. That's not even tough love. That's abandonment at best and something far darker at worst. Emily Carter survived despite her father's plans. She's here today asking you to hold him accountable for treating her life as a disposable expense. Reinhardt's closing painted Kenneth as a victim of a vindictive daughter and an overzealous legal system that criminalized the heartbreaking choices families must make. He urged the jury to see the case through the lens of compassion for a father who'd faced every parent's nightmare. But his words felt hollow against the weight of evidence Jennifer had built. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the foreperson stood and delivered the verdict. On the count of emotional distress, we find in favor of the plaintiff. On the count of financial exploitation of a vulnerable person, we find in favor of the plaintiff. On the count of breach of fiduciary duty, we find in favor of the plaintiff. The damages awarded were substantial, nearly $400,000, not because I needed the money but because the jury wanted to send a message. Kenneth's face went white. Barbara buried her face in her hands. I felt no triumph, only a grim satisfaction that the truth had been heard and believed. The criminal trial followed in November, and it was even more intense. Prosecutor James Chan brought the full weight of the state against Kenneth, arguing that his actions constituted criminal mistreatment and exploitation. The evidence from the civil trial was reintroduced, but Chan added additional elements. He brought in ethics experts who testified that Kenneth's behavior violated the fundamental principles of medical decision-making for incapacitated relatives. He showed the jury timelines comparing Kenneth's push for life support withdrawal against my actual medical improvement, demonstrating that his urgency had no medical justification. The criminal jury found Kenneth guilty of financial exploitation and criminal mistreatment, but acquitted on the attempted manslaughter charge. The judge sentenced him to 3 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 18 months. He was also ordered to pay fines and to have no contact with me unless I initiated it. As the sentence was read, Kenneth remained stone-faced. Barbara sobbed. I sat in the gallery with Michael's arm around me, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this moment. Walking out of the courthouse that final day, I was met by reporters asking how I felt about my father going to prison. I stopped and faced the cameras, choosing my words carefully. I feel like the justice system worked the way it should. My father made decisions that prioritized money over my life, and there are consequences for that. I hope this case makes other families think twice before treating their loved ones as financial burdens. Nobody should have to wake up from a coma to discover their own parent was willing to let them die to save money. The media coverage was extensive, sparking national conversations about medical ethics, family dynamics, and the intersection of healthcare and finances. Some people condemned me for prosecuting my father. Others praised my courage. I tried not to engage with either side. This had never been about public opinion. It had been about accountability and ensuring that Kenneth could never do this to anyone else. In the months that followed, I focused on rebuilding my life. My physical recovery continued, and by the following spring I was back to nearly full strength. Michael and I moved in together, finding a small house in southeast Portland with a garden where we could grow vegetables and herbs. Rachel became a regular presence in our lives, joining us for dinners and weekend hikes. Daniel and Christine began to reconnect with me cautiously, rebuilding the sibling relationship we'd never really had. Barbara reached out once, about 6 months after Kenneth began serving his sentence. She asked if we could meet for coffee. I agreed, curious what she had to say. We sat in a quiet cafe in Beaverton, and she looked older than I remembered, worn down by the trials and their aftermath. She apologized finally for not standing up to Kenneth when it mattered. She admitted she'd been too afraid of losing him, too conditioned to defer to his judgment. She'd convinced herself he must be right because the alternative, that he'd been willing to sacrifice me for money, was too horrible to accept. I listened to her apology but couldn't offer forgiveness, not yet. You chose him over me every single time, Mom. Even when my life was literally on the line, you chose his version of reality over mine. I don't know if we can come back from that. Barbara nodded, tears streaming down her face. I understand. I just wanted you to know that I see it now. I see what he was and what I allowed by staying silent. I hope someday you can forgive me, but I understand if you can't. We parted awkwardly, and I haven't seen her since, though she sends occasional texts checking on me. My freelance design business recovered and then thrived. The publicity from the case, while uncomfortable, led to new clients who admired what they called my resilience. I found myself doing work for nonprofits and advocacy groups, using my skills to tell stories that mattered. The work felt meaningful in a way my earlier projects never had. I was building something that reflected my values, not Kenneth's demands. Michael proposed on a rainy Saturday in April, almost exactly 2 years after my accident. We were hiking in Forest Park, one of my favorite places in Portland, when he stopped on a secluded trail and pulled out a simple ring. He didn't make a big speech. He just said, "I want to spend my life with someone as strong and brave as you." And I said yes immediately. We planned a small wedding for the following fall, inviting only the people who'd stood by us through everything. Daniel walked me down the aisle since Kenneth was still in prison, and wouldn't have been welcome even if he'd been free. Rachel was my maid of honor. The ceremony was held in a botanical garden, surrounded by flowers and friends who'd become family. As I stood beside Michael exchanging vows, I thought about how different my life had become from what Kenneth had planned for me. I'd chosen love over financial calculation. I'd chosen truth over complicity. I'd chosen myself over his control. Kenneth was released on parole after serving 20 months. I heard about it through Daniel but felt nothing, no fear or anger or satisfaction. He was simply irrelevant to my life now. He'd moved to Arizona, Daniel told me, living with a cousin and working as a consultant. Barbara had stayed in Oregon but they'd separated, unable to recover from the damage of the trials and his imprisonment. The family that had once defined my entire world had scattered and dissolved. Sometimes people ask if I regret pursuing the case, if I wish I just moved on and preserved family relationships. The answer is always no. What Kenneth did wasn't a mistake or a moment of poor judgment. It was the culmination of a lifetime of viewing people as assets and liabilities. If I'd stayed silent, I would have been complicit in that worldview. I would have been telling him and myself that his behavior was acceptable. Standing up, fighting back, holding him accountable, those choices freed me in ways that had nothing to do with courtroom verdicts. I think about the moment I woke up in that hospital bed, hearing my father's words and feeling the rage that pulled me back to consciousness. That rage saved my life. It gave me the strength to fight when I was at my weakest. And it transformed into something more powerful than anger. It became determination, conviction, and ultimately a kind of peace that came from knowing I'd done everything I could to protect myself and potentially others from Kenneth's cold calculations. My life now looks nothing like what Kenneth had planned. I'm married to a man who values compassion over profit. I run a business that prioritizes meaning over maximum revenue. I've built relationships based on mutual respect, rather than financial leverage. And I sleep peacefully at night knowing that when I was most vulnerable, when someone tried to reduce my life to a line item in a budget, I fought back and won. The scars from the accident are still visible, thin lines across my forehead where the windshield shattered into my skull. But they don't bother me. They're proof I survived, proof that Kenneth's calculations were wrong, proof that I'm stronger than he ever gave me credit for. Every morning when I see them in the mirror, I'm reminded that I'm here because I refuse to be silent. I refuse to be disposable. I refuse to let my father's obsession with money determine my worth or my future. Looking back, I understand that the fight wasn't really about money or even about the specific threat to turn off my life support. It was about autonomy, dignity, and the fundamental right to be valued for who you are rather than what you cost. Kenneth spent my entire childhood teaching me that everything had a price. I spent the last 2 years teaching him that some prices are too high to pay, and that actions have consequences even when they're committed by family members who think they're above accountability. If my story does anything, I hope it encourages others in similar situations to speak up. Too many people suffer in silence because the person hurting them is family, because they're told blood is thicker than water, because they're afraid of the consequences of telling the truth. But silence protects abusers and perpetuates harm. Speaking up, fighting back, demanding accountability. These acts are not betrayals. They're survival. They're self-respect. They're the beginning of healing. I survived not just the accident and the coma, but the deliberate cruelty of someone who should have protected me. I survived by refusing to accept that his actions were okay, by building a case, by finding allies, by standing up in court and telling the truth. And on the other side of that fight, I found a life worth living, built on my own terms, surrounded by people who value me for who I am. That's the real victory. Not the courtroom verdicts or the settlements, but the freedom to live authentically without fear or obligation to someone else's vision of who I should be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.